All right, Alex, how's it going?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. You okay, Kieran?
Yeah, nice to see you guys. I think we'll be in for an interesting debate or conversation today.
So, Alex, you've come appropriately dressed as, I guess, a member of, I don't know.
He's a hoodie punk.
A youth, yeah. I've come as a punk, a non-cool punk, a non-collectible punk, a punk that no one wants. I've set a floor price of 0.0003. No one wants me.
All right, so I guess that probably the best place to start is to ask how you managed to get here. So, obviously, well, I guess why don't you summarize who you are and what you do, and then how you ended up getting where you are now?
I'm Alex. I live in London, Hackney. I worked in advertising for a bit. I've worked in venture capital for about a decade. And I also have been a founder, starting a business and exiting a business called The Bakery. What I'm doing now is working with a guy called Doug Scott in his, I guess it's like his family office called Potential. And what that does is it helps people realize their potential. So at the moment, what we're doing is we're starting a bunch of funds. We've started newfinance.vc, which you obviously know very well, Mike. We've started climate.vc with a guy called Pete Denny. And we're looking to start other funds in interesting new waves. So Africa's hopefully the next one we're going to start as well. So basically what we do is we invest in people at the edges of society, the more interesting ones, the more diverse ones, the ones who do wow, interesting or funny things. And we only do things with impact in the world because, B2B productivity apps are boring. And we want to help create conscious leaders for the future because our leaders at the moment don't seem to care too much about the world or society, and they seem fairly traumatized and to only care about money and shareholder value. And it's a problem I don't think will be solved quickly, but in our own little way, we hope to create a network of all these interesting people who will create their own networks. And that's kind of where we are with Potential.
So that thesis around sort of the problem with leadership today, and I guess there's maybe a broader conversation about institutions in general. To what extent do you think sort of crypto relates to that thesis that you and Doug have? Do you think they're related, or your relationship with crypto and how that evolved is sort of separate from that sort of things?
I think it depends, doesn't it? So on one hand, I'm like, yay, crypto. On the other hand, I'm like, oh, crypto. Because obviously, I think everyone will agree we have a series of creaking, breaking, growing institutions, universities charging too much for what they can offer in a digital world, not adapting, whether it's politics, everyone just thinks it's like this performative theatre, not actually trying to solve very real problems. Everywhere you look, whether it's corporations, schools, and how we educate people, we seem to be like stuck in this weird loop where it's almost like there's like the double speak. Was it 1984 that does double speak, where everyone has believed in all these constructs and things and nobody's gone back to first principles and worked out how do you critically think, how do you actually solve problems. Anyway, so we can agree that institutions are broken. And on one hand, I go, wow, crypto, an ability to decentralizedly, not a word, go peer to peer, potentially giving people more privacy, which is going to be a huge issue in the world. I go, wow, this solves a lot of the problems. And in Bitcoin's case, I think does, with this global, open, transparent ledger and its, programmable money supply. I'm obviously a big bull on Bitcoin, and I'm like, yay, and that's the purest and best instantiation of crypto still by a mile. And so Bitcoin, money is an institution, but let's just call money an institution for a while. I go, okay, there's a potential solution. We can argue how far the solution goes there, and I go, yay. On everything else, I'm like, a lot of the crypto ecosystem, I'm very torn on, because if you look at a lot of what's working today, I just look at it going, it's the same shit. So what have you got? So let's just take DeFi. DeFi I look at and I go, oh, another system. So this is a system where you print your own money, where you leverage tokens. They call it minting, but essentially you're leveraging tokens. You're then rehypothecating these tokens out, and for every one coin in the system, there's probably another five or six that you still can't see. I think of it more like derivatives finance. It's what happens when money comes into the system, and everybody is like circularly just minting, lending out, rehypothecating, and there's just money creating money around the system. And I go, that doesn't seem like a very good use of human time. So that's sort of one point.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
Do you think that DeFi to you only represents that type of sort of wheel spinning, reinventing the wheel type stuff, or is there stuff that's happening in DeFi that you think may represent like completely new ways of structuring a financial system? Because those don't seem like they're sort of necessarily mutually exclusive. You could have this sort of waste of time stuff, but also potentially some quite interesting stuff happening in parallel, right?
You can. And what I'm talking about is just the current place, like venture capitalists are greedy in short term, and entrepreneurs tend to, the way I see it, is they look a bit greedy in short term. And there might even be arguments for why you centralize things initially. But if I look at most things, they're after the quick buck, i.e., token go up. They're after centralize the system because we can control it a lot more and make more money quickly. And so I just go, it's like 2017, right? A bunch of very excited people who all get very excited by number go up and the money pours in. Now, are there interesting things happening in DeFi? I mean, I'm less interested in DeFi. I mean, proper peer-to-peer lending, something like Maker's probably interesting in the space. There's people like Verus who are doing interesting things with self-sovereign digital identity. I'm much more interested in social tokens, although I have reservations about those. And I'm interested in new business models that these things can enable. But whenever I get excited about those, I look underneath and I go, oh, then, it's just where you are on the risk curve, right? It's like, oh, social tokens. It's some dudes who have no legal structure in the real world and they're giving out tokens and they're in a room making up as they go along. And you're like, that's fine.
Yeah. All right. So that's fine. That makes sense. And I think we're seeing the world in a very similar way. So I guess where I sort of come, where I would come from that is, you sort of started to talk about the people who are sort of using these crypto systems in order to be able to operate in a way which effectively subverts the existing rules of how things are done, whether it's lending or creating social token systems, which if you ask for permission from a regulator, they probably tell you couldn't do it, or you at least couldn't do it in the way you were trying to do it. Now, my I think underlying thesis about crypto is this idea of it being dissidence tech. So if you're not breaking a rule, you probably don't need to use a crypto system. They're designed to be censorship resistant, and they pay quite a lot of efficiency taxes in order to be that way. So if you're not breaking the rules, there's no point in you using the crypto system and paying that inefficiency tax that you have to pay in order to use a ledger. So what I'm interested in, I guess, is why it sounded like you were starting to frame that as a negative, but it seems to me to be kind of like the raison d'etre of crypto systems in general.
On that note, so Alex, just to add to that, I think just to play devil's advocate, I also think people just value privacy, not necessarily dissidence, and some of these things seem to remove barriers to entry. So you talk about MakerDAO, Alex, or maybe a platform like Alchemix, where you're able to deposit your ETH, borrow against it. It's a self-repaying loan, and you can do all that in the space of 5 minutes, and you don't have these steps to jump through.
Okay, that's true, but so the issue is that if you try to operate many of these types of networks and propositions in an anonymous way in the regulated system, you will get shut down because that's antithetical to the way that they think finance should be governed. So they start talking about things like money laundering and terrorist financing. And if you do it in a regulated environment, you're required to de-anonymize people in almost all areas of financial and even some non-financial domains as well. So I'm sort of, I think we're agreeing on that point. I'm agreeing that there's a demand for privacy in certain domains, like finance. But I guess what I'm saying is that in order to introduce the kinds of privacy people are looking for that they're not getting from traditional finance, requires you to break the underlying rules of the financial system, which is why people turn to crypto systems to, buy cocaine on the dark web.
My hypothesis is this. So I think your thing about it being inefficient, I think with things like when they do things like layer two scaling, like, and it might not be the perfect tech system and it might be no better than AWS or whatever, but I think humans being the mimetic beings that they are, crypto will be a thing. And even if you end up, with, let's just take DeFi. This is how I think it will end up. Let's just end here. I think you'll basically end up going, there will be a bunch of stuff that will end up regulated, and that will be some kind of merge between old Wall Street and the new crypto stuff. So you'll have FTX, Coinbase, and all of these crypto people that are actually centralized and Aave, and they'll all do KYC, they'll do AML, they'll be centralized, and they don't care about crypto because they care about making money, and they'll all come under this umbrella, okay? And Michael's sit there going, it's not fucking crypto, what's the fucking point, right? But it will exist because humans are greedy, and what Wall Street sells is stories, and there will be a new story of number go up, and you'll just have a new asset, and it'll be able to do new things, and there will be interesting things that they can do that they can't do at the moment in terms of the tokens, and tokens will become a thing, but it will all be under smiley new Wall Street thing.
Okay.
That to me is separate from, let me finish, that to me is separate from, this is what the true benefit of crypto is: censorship resistant, decentralization, privacy. And now my big question in that is, I think that will be a bucket. My hope is that people will end up caring about it. My fear is they don't give a fucking shit because they're too busy watching the Kardashians, and then it will just be like, 5% of people, not even 1% of people yelling at clouds going, but look, you can make your cash private. You can do your loans privately. You can take your self-sovereign digital identity, which means that you won't be subject to Google's and Apple's user agreements all the time. And you won't but I just think most people just go, yeah, I'll just trade it off.
Well, most people living in like democratic or relatively democratic countries that are relatively free don't value that affordance. People
Right.
who are living in like autocratic societies have a different set of
Right.
values and may be much more exposed to it, which is why I think crypto in general is much more interesting in like authoritarian states in terms of providing kind of a social fabric that people can use to resist the rules if the rules are actually antisocial, right? Like if
Right.
90% of people agree that the rules are antisocial, it provides a venue that everybody can go to transact safely, but against the rules of which would ordinarily require a central authority, because you don't need a central authority anymore. You have a new venue. And so I think it creates like healthy competition with the traditional institutions that have historically set the rules in domains like finance, right? So it provides a competitive force which should hopefully keep more of those institutions, or at least keep those institutions more honest.
Do you think in a democratic world then, or a more democratic world, that part of the interest is in programmability, like smart contracts and programmable money, where you're able to reduce bureaucracy and steps in these places because you're able to automate or verify things quicker? Certain things are more transparent because it's a public ledger. So to go back to the borrowing money example, I'm able to immediately prove I have X as collateral and I can borrow Y against that, and I have to click 2 buttons and it's done.
So
Yeah.
the biggest issue for me about this, I kind of like to hear what Alex thinks about this. Like the reason that I focus on the inefficiency of crypto systems is because all of the affordances that you just mentioned, whether it's privacy through encryption or the kind of asymmetric cryptography, which is, effectively provides, cryptographic signatures and everything, an open ledger system so that everybody can see all the transactions going in and out. Like none of these things require the system to be an completely decentralized blockchain-based system. You can provide all of those things on a central ledger, and if you do it on a central ledger, the transaction time is order of magnitudes faster because it's not a peer-to-peer system. So you can do it using the kinds of databases which literally do transactions in like fractions of a second. And you also you don't have the kind of cost associated with a blockchain-based system. So blockchain-based systems have to compensate people who provide what's referred to as a Sybil resistance mechanism, which is basically how you stop people spamming the network effectively. And so you have to have, mining fees or whatever, and someone has to pay that bill. If you have a centralized system with someone operating the ledger, they can throttle actors that start to act in a way that is against the collective interests of all the users. So if they start to spam tiny transactions, you can effectively censor their activity. Now that's a double-edged sword. So the purpose of a crypto system is so that that kind of censorship can't happen. And in order to solve that, they have to have these proof of work games or proof of stake or whatever it is. But on the flip side, if you accept that the system is centrally controlled by a central regulator, then all of a sudden you're accepting the censorship resistance is in place, and therefore the trading it off is more attractive, and so you can have a more efficient system.
People won't care. People won't care. People will just go. It's the same thing with like your Bitcoin self-custody. Fuck all people are going to sit there with their, self-sovereign wallets. They're going to buy the Bitcoin ETF, right? That's what most people do. In the same way, most people will, let's just say Ethereum wins. That'll be a settlements layer. It'll be slow as fuck. Fees will be high. But Optimism, Arbitrum, all these bridges that are already showing good success with lowering fees, even though it's not a pure design, it's not beautiful, like people just go, oh, and they won't even think, is it better than the new system? Because we're mimetic creatures, the narrative will be, yay, blockchain, and yay, you can do this new thing with programmable money and smart contracts, and as long as fees on layer 2 are fine, that won't matter and privacy won't matter. My point being that if you start with users and what they care about, they always trade off convenience for everything, pretty much. This is my doomsday view on humanity. And so I sort of go, yes, like you say, everything will end up regulated, but also, yes, as you say, things will be on a blockchain with layers 2s and whatever other things they build on top, because they just will. Because
do you think on that note, sort of, Mike, just wanted to say that, from the decentralization perspective as well, it's not as binary as centralized versus decentralized, and it's centralization or decentralization on a spectrum. And so people will be willing to give certain trade-offs. And so, people can debate as to whether BSC is essentially a centralized chain, or Solana versus Ethereum, and how centralized Ethereum is versus Bitcoin. But each of those points, at least a lot of the active participants have made a conscious choice to say, well, actually, I prefer using this because I'm willing to give up something else there. And so it's a trade-off. Same thing with protocols, with some of them that start centralized and they're saying we want to decentralize over time, or at least move towards a more decentralized model. So you're not dependent on 1 or 2 points of failure. Maybe you end up dependent on 10 or 20 or 50. And so you can make something slightly more censorship resistant or harder to gain, versus kind of having it as 0 or 1. It's completely decentralized, or it's fully centralized.
I totally agree about that. And I think a lot of, ultimately a lot of kind of product design decisions, and like if you think about any product that you would invest in, or if you're designing it for customers, you're thinking about turning all those dials about the various factors that users care about. So they might, in certain circumstances, really care about the fact that the system is decentralized and isn't coupled to one country's legal system, for example, like the SWIFT network is. So that may be valuable to potential users of the SWIFT network. That is true. But the other issue is that, okay, people are mimetic creatures. I agree. I do agree with that. That is clearly a truism. But what's also true is that users care about things being faster and cheaper. And it's a very tangible decision-making metric. And what I'm saying is that centralized systems are, by definition, faster and cheaper. It's impossible to make a decentralized system that's as fast and as cheap as a centralized system. It just, it's not achievable.
But even then, let's just say you're not the fastest and cheapest versus a centralized system. You may have other benefits like programmable money or smart, there will be other things that, people might pay a little bit more in moving their money around in fees. But be able to do new things.
Right, but that's kind of where I'm going with this, is that in a crypto system, the other things that the crypto system affords is not a very long list. So computable contracts, for example, don't require a blockchain. So Daml is a company that has been very successful in working with kind of more technologically progressive financial institutions on creating a layer of computable contracts, which is agnostic to whether or not the ledger underneath is some centralized database or whether or not it's a blockchain. And they've quietly been succeeding. They don't get a lot of attention because they're not a pure play crypto platform, and they allow people to do smart contracts on a normal database. But what they've shown is that all of the same affordances that you would get out of the Ethereum platform, you can get on top of a centralized database. It's just a design decision. Now,
But then let's just play with what you don't get on that database. Typically, is you don't get global write access. You can't. It's not permissionless globally that anyone can typically build on, because it started with this trusted third-party closed database. I think the openness of the database might be something that isn't figuring as highly as it might in your thinking.
you can do openness over the globe.
You can, but who is? But who would? Who is? There aren't many central institutions that do.
Right, I totally agree with you. But then we're talking about censorship there. That's effectively what we're saying. We're saying that a central operator would start to censor which kinds of actors get access and which don't. It's all a derivation of censorship. So I think for me, the question is just how much do your users, because ultimately this comes down to decisions that users make. How much do users care about the proposition versus propositions that could be delivered in a non-ideologically pure way, right?
You come back to the mimetic point, though, and I think from a user perspective, at least anecdotally and from what we see online, it's younger and younger people who do care about that because they feel more and more disenfranchised with the current system. And so in some ways, the crypto activity you can view as a populist vote on where people would like things to move towards. And again, if you talk it's on a spectrum, maybe they're more towards a libertarian end of the spectrum, but we're not talking in binary terms again. They're just talking, people feel there's certain areas where there's too much bureaucracy, there's overreach, it's too complex, you can't be an accredited investor if you're X or Y, or you need to meet certain terms. And so I think people are viewing it as a chance to get in early in a way that they're not afforded in the traditional system.
It's actually quite an interesting point, isn't it? So let's play this out, right? Because I would argue that the openness and permissionlessness brackets plus the token, right? Let's not forget the token to bootstrap it, which is why most people do it, right? But that creates cult-like community behavior. Now, can you imagine?
You mean a Ponzi? You're avoiding using the word Ponzi, but that's what you mean.
Let's ignore that for a moment, because every speculative mania has a speculative phase. But let's say American Airlines opened up their database for people to build smart contracts on and gave you American Airlines coin. Are you going to get a bunch of Gen Z millennial, Kieran, you can tell me, you're younger than me, going, yay American Airlines, or are they going to go, yay fucking whatever latest animal or food stuff has come up coin, and they'll feel a lot more affinity to that because it speaks their language, it understands them, it has an ideology and a mission. I guess I wouldn't discount community in all of it. The permissionlessness in the community might trump technology, ability and efficiencies.
Community is powerful. I'd also say that people would look and go, well, why are we supporting a legacy industry that's kind of pivoting now because they see this as an opportunity versus, why don't we create our own American Airlines, essentially?
And they'll probably fail, and they'll probably be naive, and it'll be a shit coin that won't work. But in a way, they won't fucking care.
I think some of it is very much ideologically driven. There's a lot of people who are in it for number go up and token go up, but then there's a lot of builders in the space, and I think we referenced some of them earlier, like an Arve or Kane Synthetics, where they are very dedicated to trying to build high quality stuff, and they're here for the long term, and they're building through bear markets, and they're here when no one else cared about what they were doing, and they're putting deep thought into it. But I also think that's why they represent a kind of, if there's a Venn diagram, you've got the kind of far left shit coins, and then you've got all the way to the right the real heavily regulated TradFi industry, and then these kinds of groups are slowly sitting. Maybe there's overlaps on certain edges and others there aren't. I mean, are they looking at doing KYC pools, and that's something we can chat about later, or working on it. And then they also have their traditional Aave market, so they're kind of straddling both sides of that. But they've clearly thought about about this, and in some ways they're essentially trying to build their own a bank in essence, and they're trying to improve on what they see as areas that were pain points for them before.
So I think I think probably where like I'm becoming a little bit unstuck, maybe, or at least diverging, is I think I'm agreeing that there are definitely principles and underlying technology that's been kind of shown in this wild west of crypto to be like very productive, whether that's being more open and like avoiding like very strenuous like AML requirements, all that kind of stuff, right? Like it's clear to
Any
me that they've
regulation
proven
at
that.
all.
Right, yeah, no, but I mean, there are stuff like computable contracts would be a good example, right? Like, clearly there are types of new financial product and new types of customer proposition which have evolved as a result of computable contracts being introduced. I think that's fair enough. I think where I start to just become a little bit like, I guess, a little bit more skeptical about how centralized that future of like new finance would be versus how decentralized it be, like where I think it's going to end up much more on the centralized, where it will take some of the kind of cryptographic principles
I
and
agree.
underlying philosophical stuff about having open APIs, but actually all that will end up really doing is just having a kind of much better upgraded centralized system. Maybe some of the decentralized products, like particularly the kind of crypto assets like Bitcoin, which are trying to be this kind of store of value, maybe those survive. I mean, well that I'm skeptical about whether or not it will survive the geopolitical pressure that it would be put under over the next 15 years. But let's, for argument's sake, say it did. I could at least understand that. But where I really I understand your point about memetics, right? I'm not underestimating the importance of people being memetically driven. But I guess what I'm saying is that only counts for so much, and then the rubber has to hit the road with the product. I mean, you as a VC, right, will have looked at hundreds of companies that are selling a memetic vision and have some early traction. But what you're trying to figure out is, does this well, first of all, is this team going to make it? But also, does this proposition like make any semblance of sense if I'm a customer, right?
Yeah.
And I'd say we'd had a decade of crypto. I mean, I've been going to Bitcoin meetups since 2011. We've had over a decade of crypto, and I see very little rubber on the road in terms of like real world, you're being afforded something genuinely like step change better. And if it's not a step change better, you're asking a lot of a consumer to really, really kind of adapt their behavior, which is something that crypto is asking of its users. So I would just ask you, like, what would be the top three things that make you bullish about being further along the crypto spectrum?
Yeah, so I do have it's fair to say I have a lot of cognitive dissonance with crypto, but I think this is where I end up. I end up getting more comfortable when I just think of it as spectrums of risk. Okay, so
Hmm.
when I go DeFi, right? So let all the lending and borrowing and all that stuff. And I'm going to talk in broad strokes. I tend to be less interested in that. I go, most will be centralized, most will be regulated. There will be innovations. Tokens will have some view, but will it have any particular advantage over the current system? Not ridiculously revolutionary. It will just be another asset to trade, and it will be brought into Wall Street essentially. So I
Hmm.
sort of go, all of that stuff will just pretty much end up in that system. Then I look at, let's put Bitcoin as separate, Bitcoin as money. I think that's just one in its use case. I think it's one as decentralized money. And like you say, the question is now just governments, Mike, I think.
Yeah.
And then I go, okay, so what is interesting at creating new forms of value? So genuinely new economies and new things that didn't exist before. And and then I just go, everything else I can't look too deeply into because it's just so early. It's typical early startup stuff. So you go social tokens, potentially really interesting as global coordination mechanisms. So a new way to get large groups of people coordinated around the globe
Hmm.
could be interesting. I end up going, does it just end up with, you know, we've tried governance mechanisms throughout the dawn of time, and you have ended up with boards and executives and people representing large interests. So I go, how
Hmm.
different will they really be ultimately? But I go, interesting experiment. I think NFTs have proved they have real world value. Obviously, NFTs in art are ridiculously speculative. Lots of people will lose their shirts. But the idea of having a scarce token and what you can program off scarcity, I think does open a lot of interesting use cases in the world. So how you program scarcity and build community around them, I think we're at the early stages of that. Metaverse could be interesting. Again, it's all just too early to know. Like you get a little bit burnt remembering things like Second Life and like all the promises before about, well, we're going to have some scarce real estate in this big game.
Mhm.
Like something will happen there. I think that will be interesting because you've got a lot of smart people building it. So I am interested in what in and gaming as well and how they're used in games. I think is a very obvious use case. Take your skin, use it across multiple games. So I think we have started seeing real world use cases. I do think it's still ridiculously early, but I am interested in the new economic forms of value that those things create.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you. I guess whenever I listen to like lists of these things, what I'm trying to figure out is like how much of that list is genuinely afforded in a novel way by crypto, and how much of it is just afforded by crypto because it's in this gray area where you don't have to ask for permission, so people have built it, right? So the
Well, I
question is,
think
long term, will that behavior and will those products stay on like these relatively inefficient crypto systems versus moving on to like smart ledger platforms operated by Amazon or Facebook or Apple or whoever it is, or central banks for that matter?
I think the thing that will work is the digital scarcity and ownership thing. And
Yeah.
like I say, that's where I think NFTs are starting to prove their thing.
I'm okay with that sort of like the it's particularly Bitcoin when it comes to trying to create like a non-sovereign store of value. There's like a
Yeah.
kind of game theory problem where you can't have one central authority, and Bitcoin's basically the one that's succeeded the most and has become that one sort of canonical like representation of that principle. I agree with that. The NFT one's super interesting as well because, as far as I can tell, Kieran, you know a lot more about NFTs than I do, really. But the main thing I would say about NFTs that's interesting is because they're being used for art, is actually the mechanism of using a crypto system in order to kind of own is to kind of present, distribute, and then for the end buyer to own the art is itself contributing something to the like artistic value of the thing that they're buying, right? Like that kind of.
You've created a new economy essentially, right? Almost overnight, in the sense of all of a sudden, digital artists who produced pieces before are able to sell them in a way more akin to traditional art. And so, when people talk about real world use cases, I look at that and I think, well, that's actually filtering directly back to a creator economy. And all of a sudden, these people who weren't able to make a living before, or at least not in this way, are, and they're able to program certain aspects of that to make their life easier. So royalties, as an example, a lot of traditional artists have artist resale rights, but historically they're quite hard to enforce. They're not paid often, whereas if you can program this, it's not perfect, but it automates a lot more of it. And so some of these creators are getting royalty payments that they would never be getting before, and able to sell these pieces either in additions or one of ones.
Yeah, sorry, you mean on the secondary sales,
You can get a 5% or a 10%, whatever they decide to sell at. I also think, just going one step back on the kind of value creation point, I think it's also interesting because my view on it is that to make any sort of significant regulatory changes in this space, you almost need a challenger. It's like the challenger banks, and to challenge the incumbents and to force their hand in a way that they didn't realize was possible. And I think particularly relevant to that are things like the Pandora Papers that have come out the last few days, and everyone is looking and going, well, you've got all these regulations, and yet 99% of people who are wealthy enough just flaunt them anyway, and they're able to sidestep them. They're able to do this and that in an obfuscated way. And so they will take the leap, whether it's correct or not, binary, to go the opposite way and go, well, I want to go and do something on a public immutable ledger, and I'm able to see where money's moved around, and I'm able to do this and the third. I think what happens is you probably have an inch in the middle where these two meet. You have the crypto space moving slightly closer to this edge, and the decentralized side moving slightly closer to the crypto space, and that's where you'll meet with this new finance thesis of people in the middle, and new laws and regulations are going to come out of that we wouldn't have been able to think of before because of these new problems that they're facing.
I agree with that. Aside from the bit that I think that most people who look at those papers that dropped the other day probably come to the conclusion that we need more regulation, not less, in order to solve that problem. Like that's the predominant narrative, both from politicians and from the media. There's very few. There's a niche of libertarians that are pointing the finger at the regulations themselves maybe being the cause of the problem, but that's a relatively, as far as I can tell, a relatively minority view.
I think it's because I can't speak for everyone, but like from a millennial and Gen Z lower perspective, I do think that viewpoint is becoming more and more common without it being attached with libertarian ideology. It's more just looking at these things going, these regulations are shit. They don't work. They're cumbersome. They only affect us, not the people at the top anyway. What's the point of them? And then they're kind of presented with an option where they can go and, like you say on Aave, just go and deposit some money and borrow it, and they do it at 2 clicks of a button, and it's easy, and they go, oh, well, that's interesting, and I can invest in these tokens really early, and I don't have to sign a load of stuff to say I might, whether that's protected.
I don't know whether your ordinary person can go through the mental gymnastics of saying, if we reduce the capital controls and let people move money around in a clandestine and completely anonymous free way, that will somehow lead to people doing less money laundering. I mean,
not your average person. I'm saying your people who are interested in that space. The ones who are reading that from they're an active participant, whether they're in the TradFi world or whether they're in the crypto space. I'm not saying your average student who's studying design and then reads that and then goes, oh, that's shit. Anyway, next thing. It's the people who are active thinkers. Yeah,
I think it is interesting that NFTs have created this environment, which I think, to be honest, is more to do. Again, it's not really so much to do with technology. Like we've been able to do digital signatures literally for decades. Like that's not a new thing. Like we've been able to take digital payments and like have an e-commerce store for digital art for decades, right? And if somebody could build a platform that did digital signatures and then did like royalties on secondary transactions as well, like all of that is completely achievable in a centralized way. But I guess because of the expense and the constraints of the traditional system, I mean, taking payments from consumers, for example, over the card network is quite expensive. You have to get a merchant ID on the card networks, which means you have to set up a business. Like it's very complicated. Whereas the crypto system, because it's permissionless, you could just get a wallet and then tell people to send you money. I think it has created the environment where it's attracted these kind of, I guess, like cultural leaders, right? Like artists and the type of people who are producing NFTs do tend to be the kind of people who are creating like memes on 4chan that end up spreading around the planet and all that kind of stuff. So I think maybe there is something there in terms of it being like a mimetic force.
Yeah.
I just don't know how that lasts long term.
I think it's a reminder of how humble we all have to remain, which is we now have this technology. We have no idea where it will end up. It's like nobody predicted Uber would come by GPS turn-by-turn technology, which was enabled on phones in 2009, right? And, it's like, if you think of it culturally, it's like, why did Britpop become a thing in the 90s? You're like, well, you don't really know. It just did. And it's like, we'd never have guessed that everyone would treat social Twitter avatars like Louis Vuitton bags, right? That they would use their avatars, their CryptoPunks, to signal social status. And that's like, a huge economy is built off that, simply for people desiring status. So we know the universal truths in what humans will want. We never know exactly how they will express themselves, which is why you have to go, is why I've sort of gone, coordination tools through social tokens, interesting, don't know where it will go. NFTs, interesting because digital scarcity could be programmed in millions of different ways. We don't know what culturally will be the next things. And that's what makes it both exciting, terrifying, and interesting, frankly, because
if I had to synthesize your thesis, it's that the permissionless is now allowing crypto to explore into these areas that otherwise it wouldn't have been able to. It's generating like a sort of mimetic force of its own, as well as kind of network effects and all the things associated with it. And therefore that might, from a kind of product propositional point of view, that might be enough to pull customers over the edge, so that they're not really paying attention to the fact that this is quite an inefficient system that is like expensive and slow to transact on.
I'll give you an example. Let's take synthetics, okay? I could open a Hargreaves Lansdown account and I could trade fucking, I don't know, Tesla and whatever. And there's a bunch of people who will, and I can do that for £80 a year, or I can do it for £3 per fee. There's people on the ETH ecosystem that are paying £100 per trade just to do it with synthetics, because they're in the gang, right?
Yeah.
We're irrational creatures who do things for reasons that aren't always rational, and having taken every single coordinate into account. And
Okay. Just on that point, I have to ask a follow-up question just on that specific point. So,
sure.
how much of that activity do you think is genuinely people doing what you've said, which is making a conscious decision to harbor costs that they don't really have to pay, versus having their capital tied in the crypto system where they can't get it out because as soon as they take it out, they'll be exposed to tax and they'll de-anonymize themselves?
Oh, it's not even that. I'd go further. I think most people don't even understand the tax that is happening. So I think most people are doing it because other people are doing it, and because it ideologically feels like, yay, the future. And aren't we building the future, and fuck the institutions, because they have been disenfranchised by them. And so that's where I go, it almost doesn't matter. It doesn't matter they pay more. It doesn't matter if they know they're not paying tax. They're just
But you
like,
think people are willing to pay 97 unnecessarily dollars
they
per
are, and they
transaction?
do. They won't always, as the system does, because those fees have already come down if you use layer two.
Mhm.
So number one is there will be efficiencies that come into the system and collapse some of this inefficiency you're talking about.
You know what I always think is quite interesting about this, and does sort of tie into the point that you're making, which is this point that you were making about people sort of posturing with NFTs attached to their like crypto, crap to their avatar, right, and the clear
Yeah.
value of that. I think the fact that these ledgers, where all these transactions, like the ones that you mentioned, where people are paying unnecessary fees that they don't really have to pay if they did it through the traditional system, is that those entries in the ledger are immutable and they will be there in recorded history of the origin of these crypto systems. So to some extent, it's like a very similar, and it's not like an NFT in that there's not some art attached to it, but it's more like I was there at that point and I did a transaction where I
I'd go
bought a
further, Mike.
synthetic.
Let's go further down your assumptions. You assume people think. You assume people actually engage their brains to work out what the right thing to do is. Most people don't do any of that at all. They haven't even bothered to. Have they gone on and researched every single investment platform? They don't even know how to. They haven't even looked at how to invest. They don't know what Hargreaves Lansdown or II is. They don't know how to make a loan in the real world. They just natively grew up on this system, and now they think this is the way the system should work.
Building on that point and what Mike said earlier about NFTs, that you were able to do a lot of these things before that. I think, talking of memetics, it's a product of the times and the environment where you have this coalescence of different things that have happened that essentially allow this to take hold. So having the digital scarcity Bitcoin meme happen over the last decade, which has kind of then morphed into a similar thing in Ethereum, has allowed people to be able to be prepared to frame NFTs as something digitally scarce. And that makes them much more open to that.
I totally agree with that, but this is actually what I think is the fundamental risk for crypto as an ecosystem, and that is this kind of this big mimetic bubble around Bitcoin that could get burst. So the problem is there's a couple of pretty big systemic risks for Bitcoin, which nobody in Bitcoin wants to talk about because they don't like talking about risk because it suppresses the price, that could result in Bitcoin like collapsing in value to near zero. Like that could happen. It is a possible outcome. Now, nobody wants to talk about that or discuss the reasons and the types of risks that Bitcoin has inherent to it, but that is a reality. And if that happens, then this strength, which is this kind of like mimetic force underpinning crypto, like that could instantly like turn on its head if Bitcoin starts to deflate.
I do also think, though, that you have and I think this will continue, and I'm not saying it won't affect it, but it's where you've got this divergence between kind of Bitcoin and ETH / the rest of them, and what they're doing with building on top of those is that there's a whole they're almost two separate cultures, and I don't necessarily view them as in competition with each other like a lot of people do. And so if Bitcoin does have some of these risks that come to fruition, then ETH isn't dependent on Bitcoin's price, apart from, like you say, from a mimetic point of view. So if they can separate themselves enough from that, I'm sure there'll be a big retracement. It's volatile, but it's kind of building its own culture. And then again, taking a step back to what we were discussing just before with, these people trading on synthetics, say, and paying $100 a transaction when they don't, in quotation marks, need to. I think a lot of these people are viewing it as the kind of cypherpunk, cryptopunk thing without realizing it, but where they're just like, well, yeah, I'm just part of this system, and I'm building the future, and I'm kind of contributing to that. And there's this thing down the road of L2s are going to be cheaper. There's scaling solutions on the way, so they're not viewing it as I'm going to be doing this in perpetuity. They're an active participant of this new and different system and experimentation.
Yeah, I get it. It makes sense to me, right? But the issue is like whether like. So in the age of sail, you had like Nassau, which is like this pirate state that was like this sort of idyllic, principles-based thing that started to evolve. Like it didn't grow into the United States of America. Eventually, it collapsed, right? So the thing is like it has to have longevity. Otherwise,
Yes.
effectively, it's just a very convoluted fad. So that's why I don't know whether that's true or it's not true, or whether it's survive or it won't survive. But what I try to concentrate is like take away all that stuff. Like, what is the underlying like unique affordances of these crypto systems, and how might they be derived? And I think that's when I talk about new finance, that's what I want to focus on. It's like, forget about whether it might be decentralized or centralized. I don't really care. But what's interesting is like applied cryptography to control risk. Super interesting.
Yeah.
Like computable contracts, super interesting. Open APIs, super interesting. Like it may be decentralized or centralized, but these are principles that have been proven out in the Wild West that are definitely going to influence the way the
Yeah,
financial.
and if I build on what you're saying there, you're going, the largest market in all this is going to be this bludge in the middle, this thing where these worlds have to come together because they have to, and there's so much large market in there, which means you're almost taking the Legos, the composable bits of that, which are you're going founders who understand this, therefore when this comes, they will be able to navigate it fine.
Yep,
And product wise, is this a product that can survive if the token gets regulated, if they lose their missionary people? Because if price goes down, they'll become mercenaries, not missionaries. So you're actually just going, I'm taking the building blocks in the largest possible market, and I'm
Yep.
making de-risk bets on the things that can actually scale rather than the hype machines that exist now, but may well, because they haven't built on solid foundations, be the thing that works in what will be the biggest market.
That's exactly right. Like that's essentially that's the whole point. But like, importantly, what I'm not going to do there is use my own biases about my assumptions about the future to write off people who have a different perspective on whether the future should be decentralized or centralized. Like, to be honest, I don't really know whether it should or shouldn't be decentralized or centralized. Like, there's decent arguments to say it should be decentralized because of regulatory capture and because of all the issues that you see in the traditional finance system. Whilst at the same time, there's lots of good arguments for centralizing a system because it gives you mechanisms for capital controls, which stops people money laundering,
You
et cetera,
need both.
et cetera, et cetera.
You need that. You need them in opposition to each other and trying to keep someone in chat. It's the same reason why like one party states are an issue, and that you need opposition because people will push back on one side or the other, and that sometimes things being decentralized can be an issue, and other times things being too centralized can. And those forces can create some yin and yang or some balance.
Definitely, and I think to your earlier point, which I totally agree with, about creating competitive pressure on these institutions that are the gatekeepers for these types of domains like finance, creating competitive pressure where society has a venue that they can go to say, actually, your rules are shit. Like, we don't like the rules that you're setting. We're going to use this new venue in order to organize ourselves in a way which you can't stop. Right? That is interesting. I mean, it is valuable. Now, the question is whether or not I completely agree that there is value. Like, I'm not debating that there's value in that competition being there. I guess what I'm saying is that if I had to predict the future, I would predict that despite having kind of done this very beneficial kind of Robin Hood contribution to keeping the institutions honest on an ongoing basis, I just don't know whether all the mainstream activity will sort of stream onto it over time. I think that as the incumbent system, controlled system evolves and opens up to some of these new ideas and new principles, I think it's more than likely that it will just kind of survive by adopting the principles that users really care about and dropping the decentralized stuff, because ultimately that is the fundamental antithetical bit, is the central operators, the central authorities like the FCA or the SEC or whoever, they want to be able to control risk in the market that they're in charge of, and you can't square that circle. It's just they're totally antithetical with each other.
That might be a good place to stop.
Have we done the whole hour already?
We're at 3:00.
Wow. I did a lot of
So-
talking then. I feel like we should have maybe grilled Alex a bit more.
You better close off, if in case this goes anywhere, close it off properly.
Tune in next time.
Bye.
For a
Keep
skeptic's
it
guide to new finance.
forward.
Thanks, Alex and Mike.
Yeah.
It was really
Yeah,
interesting.
thank you both of you. Thanks for doing that, Alex. Appreciate it.
No worries.